Hi, guys. Welcome back to another episode of Unfollowing Mum. Thank you so much for being here. Today, I have another guest with me, and I'm really excited to chat to her today. I think the topic that we are going to be chatting about is going to be so relevant for so many people and will hopefully have a really big impact on helping you move forward if this has been your experience. So, without further ado, I have Lynn Smith Gregory. Hi, how are you?
Good. Thank you so much for having me, Harriet. I'm delighted to be here.
Oh, thank you for coming on. For listeners who don't know anything about you at all, can you let them know a little bit about who you are, what you do, and what you specialize in?
Well, I'm a writer who's written a memoir about leaving a high control religion, in my case, Mormonism, as a descendant of the founder of that religion, Joseph Smith. My maiden name
Wow.
is Smith. And he was my great great uncle. My great great grandfather was his younger brother and the first convert to the Mormon church. So I don't know if your listeners know much about the Mormon church, but it is very much a religion that exerts a lot of control over its members.
Mm.
Members can't smoke, drink, gamble, swear, no premarital sex, and it's quite conservative in almost every realm. And I discovered at 19, when I went away to school at a non-Mormon university, that who I thought my great great uncle was and my great great grandfather was the narrative that the church had told me about them wasn't historically accurate. And I did a deeper dive into the Mormon church and found out a lot of conflicts between what I had been told happened and what in fact actually did happen. And in a very short period of time, I went from being a true believer to being absolutely a non-believer.
Wow.
And I wasn't even sure if God existed because the only reference I had for God was a Mormon foundation. And I realized that was a fraud and that Joseph Smith was a con artist, that he confabulated a whole religion out of whole cloth. And what had been something I was very proud of and the envy of my friends now became a source of shame. And so it led to an estrangement with my family.
Mm.
Um, After 4 generations of devotion to the Mormon church, I was leaving the church and I felt compelled to move 2,000 miles away from Salt Lake City to New York City to try to find the anonymity I thought I would achieve there and make it easier for me to reinvent myself,
Yeah.
basically. Um, but I know, as you've talked on other podcasts, reinventing yourself when you are displacing or disregarding the very foundations that you grew up with is more difficult than I ever imagined it would be. I didn't know who I was without the framework of the Mormon church. I didn't know exactly what my values were, what I did believe in. And I also didn't want to duplicate the dysfunction that I saw, that was a lot of it was religiously based dysfunction of my home in starting my own family and having children. In Mormon societies, the man is the patriarch and king of the castle.
Mm.
And the role my mother had in the family was one that I saw that was not very appealing to me, very powerless. She didn't make any major decisions. She couldn't protect us from my father's rages. Um, and um, the whole concept of what a woman's role was to be put a positive spin on things, toxic positivity, smile, be small, be quiet, sit down, don't make a fuss. And that had long-term implications for my self-esteem. So I realized it was really creating a lot of trauma. And I didn't want to duplicate that when I had children of my own.
I think there's so many things that you said there that are really huge, particularly that shame surrounding moving away from that experience and realizing that, okay, everything you've been brought up to believe, everything that you have been indoctrinated with, really, is
Right.
absolutely not what you believe in, is not the norm. And it's interesting that you'd mentioned about it being when you moved away, that was when you started to really discover these things. So when you stepped out of the toxic family unit, is that right?
I was challenged when I went away to college by a university professor that I adored, but he was an atheist. And when he found out I was a believer, he basically challenged me to defend my faith in his next class, The Bible is Literature. And in doing so, I read everything I could get my hands on, including books that had been forbidden for me to read
Okay.
before. And that is when I discovered that the Mormon Church was based on a series of falsehoods. And by the time I was done with my research, I was no longer a believer.
Mhm. It's such a big shift in at such a young age. It's such a huge shift. And as you say, it's quite startling to think that in a even a modern society, that there are certain books that are banned and there are certain things that you're not allowed to do, be it because you're female, be it because conflicts with the religious belief. That level of control is so stifling and so all-consuming as well.
Yes. And I think that you mentioned the control, and I think that was one of the hardest things for me to deal with in recovering from the trauma of my past. Obedience was paramount in the church, and obedience and service, particularly for women.
Mhm.
And I was not taught to honor my own instincts or my own sense of reality about a situation, but to defer to a higher authority, which in this case was always male,
Mm.
always, these old guys running the church, their opinions, dictated every aspect of my life, including, becoming aware of my sexuality, uh and it was invasive, the control that they because it was sinful to have impure thoughts, not just actions, but thoughts. And like you can control everything that you're thinking. And I was such an innocent and so naive. And it wasn't until much later that I got in touch with my rage
Mm.
about being through this kind of intrusive uh, attempt at mind control.
I think when from the people that I have spoken to, I did not grow up with a religious background. So for me, when I've spoken to people who have had that kind of religious abuse and that spiritual abuse, it is that all-encompassing control and that mind control, as you say. And I think a lot of people will relate to not really feeling obliged and not really being able to step away from that and feeling like they have to be obedient and that they have to be subservient. I think even if you don't come at it from a religious angle, that's something that I've found throughout many talks with people who've grown up in toxic family dynamics, that sense of you have to obey me and you have to be grateful to me and you have to almost bow down to me because I've raised you and I've given you life. That seems to be a very common thread. But then add the religious element on top of that, and you have this network of older, very male people. It opens you up to so much abuse and puts you in such a vulnerable position.
Exactly. I think, when you add the element of judgment, you're a good person or you're a sinner, or,
Mm.
you know, listening to yourself is listening to the devil. It makes it very confusing to sort out, what is normal or natural even, but um, you discount your own judgment. And then, what do you have if you don't have this inner core that has been validated by a parental figure, telling you who you are, that's been reflected back in their eyes and in their statements, and you're really kind of starting from scratch. um, who am I, and what do I believe, and what is true? And all the questions are on the table for the first time. And after the certainty of Mormons having the answer to everything, I had the answers to nothing.
Mhm.
And like, why are we on the planet? And what is our purpose in life? And, these were really big questions that I struggled to understand as, a 19-year-old.
Mm.
And so I wrote my story is about that I wrote in my memoir that is currently being, my agent is sending it out to publishers as we speak. So we're looking to find a home, and hopefully it'll be published this year. The title of my memoir is We Were Smiths: Escaping the Shadow of Joseph Smith's Mormon Legacy. And it was an escape from not only the religious, but the familial uh, patterns, long term. I had, a grandfather who was a polygamist, for example, and uh, very much uh, a man of his times in Mormon history. Um, but um, you know, getting out from underneath that and seeing myself as uh, a separate entity, I was left to define myself through very slow awareness, and awareness of what made me happy, what did I hold to be true, what did I value. And I think it's really important in situations like this, and as I encourage others who are in a similar situation to myself, to find support, like-minded, a like-minded community. I felt very isolated, very alone. I didn't know any other people who had left the church
Mm.
that had left it in the way that I had, from a situation of disbelieving the fundamental truths of the Mormon church. And I didn't have anyone to talk to. I luckily did seek out therapy, and that was very helpful. And I would encourage people to get the kind of support to start to unpack their experiences, and particularly in a situation like mine, where it was a dysfunctional family on top of a religiously controlled family.
Mm. And you mentioned the generational trauma there. Obviously, you've come from the very foundation of the church for you, with that family name, with that experience, and with that lineage, to step outside of it. That was even more of an experience, to finally step aside. And as you said, you start to see yourself as a separate entity. And so much of what happens when we are in these toxic family dynamics is that we become so enmeshed with each other and so codependent upon each other, so stuck in trying to please one another, or rather trying to please whoever is the figurehead or whoever is the one pulling all of the strings. And there's such a sense there
Exactly.
of, yeah, such a sense there of having to do what you are told and fall in line. But you mentioned that you came away from this when you were 19. And again, finding that community, that was what drove me to set up this podcast, was hoping that I could create a community for people where they could have that community healing, because it is so powerful to know that you're not alone. And I think if there's anything that this podcast has taught us over the last year or so of doing it, it's that you're never alone in the experiences that you have. You absolutely are not. There will be someone else out there who has shared your lived experience or similar to, and can relate and can help you to find understanding and validation for what you're feeling. Again, with therapy is such a huge part of the healing journey, stepping outside of this toxic family dynamic. You mentioned that you completely cut contact with your whole family. Was that when you were 19? Everybody?
Well, when I didn't tell my family for a while, but I stopped going to church at college, and the church came looking for me. Um, they knew who I was and my lineage, and they wanted to know what was going on, why I wasn't showing up at Mormon uh, social events and church. And when I told them, I realized they would get back to my parents. And so I
Mm.
needed to tell my parents. So I was a little older than that when I kind of came clean. And my mother was absolutely devastated. In her mind, I was making eternal choices that would keep me in utter darkness forever. And uh, she, as was my mother's coping mechanism, kind of went into denial.
Mm.
Uh, and I think it was her way of coping with not being able to control much of her life. You'll return. That was her idea. This is just a passing phase. You'll come back to the church one day. And I think that's how she put up with a lot of with my estrangement, and but also a lot of other issues she had in her life,
Mm.
living under the thumb of a patriarch. Um, but my father was more, he was deeply disappointed. I was his favorite. I was sort of, in a lot of ways, I was one of the older children and the golden child in the family, a high
Mm.
achiever. I graduated a year early from high school. I had scholarships to school, college. Um, and he, um, and that was the hardest thing, was to lose his respect and love and approval. And I was no longer on the pedestal as the example for my younger brothers and sisters to follow. I had gotten knocked off the pedestal quite abruptly. And it was hard seeing my younger brothers and sisters no longer come to me for advice, or they basically kept their distance, because it's almost like they don't want to catch it, like you could contaminate them.
Yeah.
And I didn't want to share with my brothers and sisters what I had discovered about the Mormon church, because I knew how my parents would feel about that I was leading my younger brothers and sisters astray.
Mm.
And in their view, I was being led astray by Satan,
Yeah.
so there was no win in trying to do that. But it hurt. So the estrangement was partially on my part and partially on their part. Uh, I didn't have a place in the family anymore. Um, Everyone else was a Mormon. Now, I had a very close sister um, who was a teenage rebel, so to speak, the black sheep of the family, unlike me, who was the goody two shoes, the
Mm.
last person they expected to leave the church. And she had been kicked out of the house because she was incorrigible or they couldn't control her. And my father made it clear that unless she conformed, there was no place for her in the family. And
Wow.
so I knew the boundaries that were there. And I didn't want to break contact completely, whereas my sister did. When she
Okay.
was kicked out, she basically left and moved to San Francisco. But she and I were close, even though we were very different people. And she and I made different choices about how to deal with the loss of a belief system. And we ended up in very different places because of the choices that we made, I think.
Mm. And I think when you have a toxic family dynamic, it is very much that you're all in or you are all out. There's no kind of gray area. You would think in a healthy, loving, respectful relationship, you would be able to say, hey, I don't hold the same religious beliefs as you. And that's okay. We still have a relationship. We're still healthy. This is cool. You do your thing. I'll do my thing. We're all good. And when you have that much abuse going on and that real indoctrination, that's never going to happen. You're either all in or there's nothing. And I've spoken to people before who have been a Jehovah Witness religion, and that's been very much the same thing. It's either you are a part of this or you're out of it. And if you can't behave a certain way, as with your sister, get out. And that's so
Right.
difficult to make your peace with. And you mentioned that you'd both gone down different paths. Can you tell a little bit more on that for me?
Well, her rebellion, took the form of kind of becoming a bad girl, a lot of drinking, drugs, promiscuity, where I was leaving because of an intellectual understanding that it wasn't based on fact. She was more rebelling against the confines, the restrictions of the religion. But I'm not, and she was much more of uh, a nihilist, an atheist. This nothing means anything. Uh,
Mm.
and I kept searching for meaning. There has to be some reason, we exist and we're on the planet and we are capable of love and altruism. And and so she went down a very destructive path, and
Mm.
it was a downward spiral that continued really. Um, but her 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 situation ultimately ended up where she was in rehab and and we were called together as a family, uh and my younger sister revealed a secret which I won't share here. It's going to be in the book, but
Mm.
it it imploded the family.
Wow.
And that sent us all reeling. And we had to decide, was there a way to be a family uh, with this kind of trauma being introduced, and this level of dysfunction. And to my family's credit, we decided at the facilitator's recommendation to go into family therapy.
Oh, wow.
And so, yes, and it's so unusual to have that gift, to have that opportunity, to have that willingness on everyone's part. And that saved us as a family. Um, we decided we would gather annually for family therapy and family reunions for 3 or 4 days and spend time with each other. And we learned skills. We were given tools to learn how to speak respectfully to each other about our belief systems and our different spiritual paths, and to find the common ground. And we found that while we did not believe the same things, that we were more alike than we were different.
Mm.
And that helped tremendously. Our values were still very similar. We both believed in the importance of family and of family loyalty. We just had to redefine what that looked like and build a big enough tent for all of us to fit under.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful that you all managed to come together because, as you say, it's so rare to find that everyone is willing to do so. Either there is too much stubbornness and an unwillingness to have accountability for the things that you have done, or the hurt's too deep and you've just got to a point where you think, I can't trust it and I never will again, and I need to remove myself because that's not going to work for me. And I think whatever path people go down, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. That's fine. It is wonderful when you do hear stories of people having been able to get into family therapy and to make those changes together, because that's all anybody really asks for when they're having problems with family. Nobody particularly wants to have to cut family members out, but they do it because they don't feel that there is any other alternative.
Exactly. And um, I really have found that most situations, it's too toxic to remain in contact. It's not a safe place to be. There is still, accusations, assumptions, and if someone can't feel safe, you don't have those guidelines that you've all agreed to in place, it's a situation that's best avoided. And I know my story, when I talk to others, is unusual. And I think it's important to get an evaluation of the situation with a therapist about whether or not there is potential for re-engagement that is healthy and that could be positive, and not keep banging your head against the wall. And there were still limits. Some of the things I would like to talk about were off the table because I knew they were too volatile.
Mm.
And so we tried to focus on what we did share. And interestingly enough, we found that the dynamic that worked best is to leave my parents out of it. And we kids ran the family reunions. We took turns being in charge of them. And that changed already my father making all the decisions for everyone.
Mm.
Uh, so breaking it up a little bit, shifting that. And of course, we all had the experience uh, of being parents, eventually, and we could talk about, how similar our experiences were and our hopes and dreams for our children,
Mm.
and how much we wanted the world to be a kinder, safer, better place. And those were things that we could agree on.
Yeah. And finding that common ground, especially as parents yourself. I think often when you do have your own children, in my experience, that has been when I have found most people have started to reflect. And I know yours is different, discovering this rift earlier on. But you start to look as a parent at all of the things that you experienced as a child and think, well, what if that happened to my child? I would never want that. I would never want that for my child. And that's when it really starts to come up for you of, yeah, no, this would not fly if this was my children. And in having that shared experience with siblings, once they become parents and being able to say, oh, hang on a minute, actually, I wouldn't want that for them either. That must be really powerful.
You're so right. And like my brothers and sisters also didn't want to duplicate our very dysfunctional upbringing. My father was physically as well as verbally abusive, and my mother was powerless and couldn't protect us. And so I actually, when I started having children, realized I didn't have role models for how I
Mm.
wanted to parent, and ended up taking parent education classes, discovered that that was so helpful and so I felt so uh, I felt so supported in having new tools and new ways, new role models about how I wanted to parent, that I actually ended up becoming a facilitator and teaching the classes myself uh, for 10 years in the public and private school systems in Atlanta, because it was so powerful to have alternatives to what, you know, we've all had that experience where, well, I don't know, but I have, of opening your mouth and your mother comes out or your father
Yeah.
comes out, and you're just appalled and shocked. But unless you have something to replace it, it's likely to happen.
Mm. It's interesting that you mention that because I think when you are someone who is breaking those generational trauma patterns and you are someone who hasn't had a healthy blueprint, to find that you have suddenly got nothing to fall back on, but to find this voice that you know has caused you so much damage pop out of you, and you think, oh, I'm just like them. I'm just like them. And yeah, it's such a frustrating part of being a cycle breaking parent and moving through the generational trauma that you have inherited and setting aside the things that don't serve you while still holding on to the bits that perhaps were good tools and building that toolbox. As you say, it's really difficult to navigate, and it is one of the most challenging parts, I think, when you do have your own children.
Exactly. You've just articulated that so well. It's, you know, um, alternative ways of approaching it, and realizing that you were breaking generational cycles allowed me to be a little more forgiving and compassionate with myself as I was trying to make these changes and adopting, like you said, a new blueprint for how to parent. Because it, it was so important to me to be different,
Mm.
but I didn't always do it perfectly. And developing that uh, self-compassion, um, which went against everything I had grown up learning. Self-compassion was not a good thing. You couldn't be proud of your accomplishments. God was responsible for your accomplishments, there were just so many layers to uh, a healthy self-esteem
Mm.
and awareness. But uh, and so, you know, um, it's even hard for me now to say that I'm proud of the way I ended up parenting my children because it feels boastful or something.
Yeah.
But um, it's it wouldn't have happened if I hadn't had the support of a community and role models that showed me a different way, a different
Mm.
path,
Mm.
and support for also the fact that I wasn't doing it perfectly. And I think it's it means so much to us, you know. I I think nothing matters more to most mothers than thinking that they've done a good job as a mother. And when it matters that much, it's just really a hot topic. And we have to have that compassion for ourselves that we're not doing it perfectly, but it's good enough. And
Mm.
we're changing, long term, like you said, generational patterns of abuse, um and establishing new ways and modeling those new ways to your children so they know they're better able to be parents, and they have a blueprint that is going to work for them, based on the way you modeled it. I know the first time I learned to say, um, I can't talk about that right now. I'm too upset. I'll have to get back to you rather than lose it. Um, and then noticing my daughter using it with her brother. Kyle, I can't talk to you about this.
Yeah.
I'm too upset. And you go, oh wow, this is exactly how it gets transferred.
Yeah, they pick
It's so
things up so
powerful.
much, don't they? They're like sponges, and we were like sponges. And this is the problem, is that we absorbed all of that toxicity, and now it's a case of wringing out the sponge and saying, what can we fill this cup with? And what
Perfect.
changes can we make?
That's
And then
perfect.
passing them on. There is nothing better. I remember I always joked that I broke the cycle a bit too close to the sun, because my now 13-year-old son, when he was about 11, 12, I remember him turning around to me and I was getting really heated because we were discussing something and we were arguing, and he didn't want to do what I was asking him to do. He's neurodivergent anyway, so he was really like digging his heels in and like, I'm not doing what you say, I'm neurodivergent. So I was like, well, I think this should be done. And we were just ridiculous. And he just put his hand up and he went, excuse me, can you not speak to me like that? Because that does not make me feel good. Can we just take this down a tone? And I was like, oh yeah. Okay. And
Uh-huh.
you don't know what to say in the moment, because you would never have felt the freedom to be able to
To do
challenge.
that,
Yeah, to
challenge a
challenge.
parent figure.
But I
Uh-huh.
was getting absolutely heated, and I wasn't speaking to him kindly, and I wasn't speaking to him respectfully either. And he used that word. He said, I'm not speaking to you like that, so can we speak respectfully? And I just thought, touche, kid, what can I say? Because, and even
Exactly.
now, as he's got older and he's in that real kind of teen phase, he will sometimes really snap or be quite aggressive in his tone and quite abrupt, as teenagers are wont to do. And then he will quite often, not always, but quite often, check himself and go, sorry, actually I shouldn't speak to you like that, let me try again. And it's just wonderful to see,
Wonderful.
but very confronting as well at the same time sometimes, because it reminds you of all the ways in which you didn't get that. And it can make you feel so proud of yourself. But again, it can be quite confronting. You've just got to kind of sit with those feelings and let them wash over you and keep moving forward as best you can, and imperfectly as well, because as I say, I was getting really heated with him and he just put his little hand up, excuse me, mummy. And it just really made me
Right.
laugh. And it was exactly what
Right.
was needed in that moment to check
Yes.
myself and for him to be able to articulate it.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely perfect
Mm.
and wonderful, because you do see in real time that change has happened.
Exactly. And those changes do take time, but they do happen with the effort that we put in and when we can relearn that blueprint. Lynn, thank you so much. You've been such a wonderful guest. Can you let my audience know where they can get your book and where they can find you?
Thank you so much, Harriet. Right now, the best place to keep up with my path to publication is my website, which is Lynn, spelled with one N, lynnsmithgregory.com. That's my website, and it will have information about uh, when the book will come out and become available, but also um, you'll have access to things I speak on, like I have blogs talking about family estrangement, uh, the high depression rates of women in Utah, Mormon women. They have some of the highest depression rates
Wow.
in the country. And also, just on various topics relating to leaving a high control religion, and also how you heal
Mhm.
family estrangement when it is a good idea and is possible.
Mm. Honestly, what a wonderful resource. Thank you so much, Lynn, for coming on and for taking the time to speak to me. And I am keeping my fingers and toes crossed that publication comes soon.
Thank you so much. And I so appreciate the work that you're doing and the kind of community you're providing. You're just a great resource.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Right, guys, I will speak to you again next week. Take care. And I will see you soon. Don't forget, I will leave everything in the bio. And if you do want to come and follow along with me, then I have our estrangement and low contact toxic family dynamic community. It's not just for people that are estranged, but for anybody who's navigating any of these experiences that we talk about on the podcast. That is at unfollowing_mum on Instagram. And then you can always find me at Toby and Rue on Instagram and at It's Harriet Shearsmith on TikTok. Keep your fingers and toes crossed. We can change that Instagram name soon because I would really, really like to, but Instagram are not allowing it. Speak to you soon,
Oh,
guys. Bye.